Pernah bekerja di Kedutaan Besar Jepang di Jakarta. Sudah lama, yang 4 tahun yang lalu, semua orang ini belum lahir. Jadi sudah rupa dan berbicara dan Inggris. When Dino invited me, he said it's something like a rock concert. So I went to prepare some karaoke, but I don't think I have chance to. I'm sorry. But I'm very honored to be here because I was serving with Dino as ambassador of Japan to United States. 7 years ago, I retired. On that day, I told my wife, Yoriko, now I can say anything. My wife said, but dear, no one cares anymore. So I'm very honored to be here. Now, the main question, why are we here? Simple. After the World War II, people believed that if we made the world more freer, people will really benefit from that. And also, major powers would not really resort to unilateral military interventions. In short, goodwill. However, that was wrong. You have seen that great powers had gone to Crimea, Ukraine, South China Sea, also in economy. If you make it free, of course, those better conditioned ones will get everything. First, Japan came and tried to get the world market. But then we were suppressed, and now China trying to take over. If there's no restriction, of course, a lot of people will take as much as possible. And last, international organizations that was created for stability, regional organizations. But EU failed because it brought in too much strong restrictions by bureaucracy. And also, no country can have millions of refugees. So that was the failure. Now we have to see everything from that point, that we have failed and how we can create. But if I may say one thing about US-China, I think we should look at it that it's fortunate, lucky, that there's a confrontation between US and China now. Why? It's not to take advantage of it. No, if we woke up 30 years later, and found that China was dominating everything, 5G or 6G or whatever, and military and economy, we would have a much more difficult condition. Thank you very much.
Throughout this morning, all of us have become increasingly aware of the notion of hot peace, as you have so eloquently described as well in your own remarks. I wouldn't want to add too much on defining or seeking an illustration of this situation, because I think it is well understandable for one to describe the current situation as one of hot peace, as you have said. The more pertinent question, I think, in a forum like this type is how can one proceed, go beyond simply describing the phenomenon that we are facing. And by the way, when we are referring to the so-called hot peace, it is not only about China and the United States. We have amidst us, including in this region, a number of other important dynamics that are competitive in nature. For instance, relationship between Japan and China, China and India, Japan and Korea, and many other bilateral, so to speak, whose development and trajectory will impact on all of us. Not only interstate relationship, I think whenever you consider the future, we must also recognize that ours is a world where the distinction between internal and external issues are becoming increasingly tested, and the differentiation between political security domain and economic domain are also increasingly becoming blurred. In other words, it is a very dynamic and a very uncertain world that we are facing. But the main question, I think, we need to proceed beyond describing things, beyond even analyzing the dynamics before us, but to identify potential cures, potential responses. And this, I think, is where a forum of this type can be extremely pertinent. For instance, in my opinion, in my personal view, one of the challenges that we face as we are dealing with this uncertainty and the geopolitical shifts and changes is how can we avoid the potential for miscalculation, for countries to misinterpret one another's intention, and thus allow what was originally a minor incident to develop into a crisis and even to an open conflict. Are the governance existing in our region and beyond to deal with crisis? I know that there is almost like a paradox of plenty. We have many forums, many meetings, but when certain incidences happen and certain crises begin to develop, I find often case there is like a deafening silence, inability to take timely, concrete action to diffuse the tensions. Crisis management, I think, is a capacity that is in urgent need in our region. The idea of addressing trust deficit, I think this is an issue that is extremely pertinent as well. In other words, how can we ensure that we do not have governance deficit, that we do not have trust deficit, or even leadership deficit? I think in many cases, the way we conduct ourselves and the institutions by which nations organize themselves are 20th century institutions, when the problem that we are confronting are 21st century. They are transboundary, transnational, national, local, national, regional, global, all at the same time. And yet, the remedy we are proposing have been shaped and molded and formed from the experiences of many decades past. We need intellectual leadership by Indonesian young people and leaders and the like. In other words, we need concrete, actionable bullet points to respond to the hot piece that you had mentioned. In other words, to go beyond describing and even analyzing what we are confronting. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. Now, we have two former foreign ministers here, and I think in all the speeches and declaration, we always hear about the need for differences to be addressed through dialogue and consultation, right? That's part of our. But tell me something. We have a lot of that now, right? G20, APEC, ARF, EAS, you name it, and our leaders are meeting a lot more than many other leaders in previous generation. But yet, we are experiencing more trust deficit, more rivalry. Yeah? What is going on? Are these forums not effective enough to dampen things? Yeah.
Well, I think what's going on is that when Marty and I were foreign ministers and the ambassador was in Washington, life was pretty simple and straightforward. The United States was the great power, but China was on the rise. And when you look further down the track, you could see, as we saw Foreign Minister Retno saying today, the projections which saw Indonesia as the fourth largest economy in the world by at least 2050, and India the second largest economy by 2050. So that drove the notion of the Indo-Pacific, which ASEAN and Australia have adopted. And so we could see a changing world where China, India, US, and Indonesia were the four great powers. And that was all working fine. But then two things happened. Firstly, China changed from what we used to describe as the Deng Xiaoping consensus or the Bob Zoellick responsible stakeholder, where no one was expecting that China would give up its own internal system. But when it entered the world, which we all encouraged as an economic and strategic player, it would play by the rules of the road, it would be a responsible stakeholder, it would consult and it would make decisions in a collegiate way. That then changed with Xi Jinping's determination to become a much more aggressive and assertive Chinese leader, and for China to become much more assertive itself. And probably the best two examples of that are China's action in the South China Sea and refusing to pay any heed to the Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision that their action there was contrary to international law, and more recently, their conduct with respect to the Uyghurs. So that was one changed element. The China that Marty and I dealt with is now a different China, a changed China, and it's much more problematic because of that aggressive, assertive nature. At the same time, the United States that Marty and I and the ambassador dealt with was a much easier United States to deal with. What we now describe in diplomatic terms, a much more assertive or aggressive China. With respect to the United States, we say it's a United States now with much more policy uncertainty. In other words, Donald Trump. So you've got what we saw coming, a changing global landscape where the United States went from a very brief period of one-off hegemony after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, which we all encouraged, so you'd see two great powers, and then by the midpoint of this century there'd be three great powers, India, another country of over 1 billion people, and the world has to make its adjustments when great powers go from 1 to 2 to 3, but we all saw that as being an orderly step along the way. A much more assertive and aggressive China and policy uncertainty from the US has made us much more nervous and worried, and as Marty says, the danger or the risk of misjudgment or miscalculation. So we're doing a lot more talking these days, but we're not sure that the two great powers are actually listening to what countries like Indonesia, Australia, India, Japan are saying to them. So we continue to need to encourage US and China to make their relationship better, both on the economic but also on the political, military, strategic front. And we need to do that in a more coordinated way, which forums like the East Asia Summit do provide for us, and the G20, but also, as was mentioned earlier in the opening session, much more country-based or regional-based activity. So Indonesia, Japan, Australia, for example, have a trilateral. That's a good thing to do. India, Indonesia, Australia have a trilateral. That's a good thing to do. The more we're finding getting like-minded countries together and having conversations and then putting a view to the two great powers has to be a help. One thing we can't do is that we can't stop talking either to China or the United States. That would be the worst thing that we could do. So to not engage with China, to not engage with the United States would be the worst thing we could do. But because, as I said in my opening remarks, you've now got the interrelationship between strategic competition or a Cold War between the US and China, with economics and trade and investment and prosperity inextricably interwoven with that, it's much more difficult for countries like Australia, Indonesia, Japan to deal with that. The old Cold War was quite straightforward. Whose side are you on? Are you on the US or the Soviet Union? That was quite simple, with not too many economic consequences as a result. Now there are big economic consequences from either ignoring the problem or choosing sides.
Pa Ichiro, I want to ask you, do you think China will become a superpower?
I take a little different view on China. I think China there's a big frustration of people who are not really affluent elites because it is under communist regime. Communist basic principle is that everyone should be equally poor. But no, it's not. Huge discrepancy. Haves and have-nots are there. Now, leaders have to be very careful in managing that society, trying to punish those dissidents, do not allow Hong Kong people to go free, has to resort to nationalism, South China Sea, aircraft carrier, fight with the United States. They have to be very careful. So I think we should not be deceived by China's dream, 2049 or whatever, big things. They are trying to hold that very delicate system. And for that, they are really fighting every day. And I don't know if they'll succeed, but one thing I can say is that because of G7, G20, APEC, RCEP, all these meetings, they are occasion for leaders to meet, and if leaders meet, the civil servants will prepare, and I think it's a great occasion for, so even though there are conflicts, I think there are a lot of meaning for those meetings, and I think we should really put high emphasis on that. And for example, China and Japan had been very cool, but relations are becoming warmer now. Xi Jinping is expected to come to Japan next spring, and this is a huge change, and it's occurring through these exchanges of leaders on the fringe of these G7, G20, and I think ASEAN is doing a great job as a core regional organization in Southeast Asia.
Pak Marty, when you were foreign minister, you fought hard for an Indo-Pacific-wide treaty scheme. And what were you hoping to achieve with that? And do you think the present arrangement with Indo-Pacific that you see today, would that be a game changer in terms of modifying major power relationship?
Well, I'm not really into labeling, giving labels or terminologies to efforts. But indeed, because over the several decades now, as far as Indonesia is concerned and ASEAN, we have always been invested in an Indo-Pacific outlook. You know, when you look at the East Asia Summit, the way it has been constituted, the membership, it is not only East Asia. It includes Australia, New Zealand, India, from the very beginning. So that was clearly inspired by an Indo-Pacific outlook, as well the ASEAN Regional Forum, whose composition extend beyond East Asia proper. So although the term is only most recently become popularized, as far as Indonesian foreign policy is concerned, it has always inspired and imbued our approaches. But you are quite right, in the recent past, personally, I have been driven and inspired by the notion of promoting the idea of non-use of force among all the Indo-Pacific countries, principally the East Asia Summit countries. Because amongst ASEAN countries, we have the TAC, the 1976 Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, whereby countries of Southeast Asia commit themselves not to use force in their relationship with one another. The idea has been how to externalize ASEAN's experience, how to now connect the outer dots. How can we ensure, for instance, between China and Japan, between China and India, they can also make similar commitment, non-use of force commitment. Because the problems, the challenges, the potential for disputes are plentiful. But surely we can at least agree that in resolving these problems, we will not resort to the use of force. But connecting these outer dots or outer points will not be an easy task. Actually, we wouldn't be starting from zero. We already have the wherewithal. The Bali Principles of 2011 of the East Asia Summit actually provides and recognizes the non-use of force among the East Asian Summit countries. But we need to elevate it to the higher level, meaning to a legally binding treaty. Just as an illustration of how difficult such a Indo-Pacific-wide or East Asia Summit-wide non-use of force commitment would be, look at what's happening now with RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. I am informed from what I am reading that all countries, with the exception of India, are already on board, and there is still some difficulties that India is facing to sign on to this idea. But that is normal, and the sovereign right of the country concerned is quite natural. But what I find a little bit unnatural and a little bit unusual and in a way regrettable is if ASEAN was to adopt a passive attitude. If ASEAN was to simply say, well, that's too bad. Let's proceed without India. Because then we are not proving the centrality of ASEAN to be able to deliver, because RCEP is ASEAN's initiative. It was during Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN in 2011 that we brought the subject matter. How to ensure that we have free trade area, not only between ASEAN and dialogue partners, but between the dialogue partners, we also have comprehensive economic partnership. ASEAN cannot be passive. ASEAN introduced this subject matter in the first place, and ASEAN cannot now, when it matters most, dissect themselves to individual member states' national approaches, and then simply saying, well, that's too bad. India is enjoying. I would rather, personally, that we take our time, let the idea mature, and have India on board right from the beginning, rather than simply crystallizing and codifying the current situation. Because if we speak of Indo-Pacific in terms of beyond outlook, in terms of actual concrete policy, the time to deliver is now. Outlook alone is not sufficient. We need to deliver.
Australia and Indonesia, and Marty and I, and before that Marty and Hassan Wiriuda, we would talk generally about the notion of the Indo-Pacific, but it wasn't until 2013 that the Indo-Pacific notion became a formal Australian foreign policy document. And we've seen in recent times it's now been adopted basically by everyone in the region, because they see that with the rise of Indonesia as the fourth largest economy, the rise of India as the second largest economy, it's the best strategic framework to have. So we've been working off that script, if you like, for a long period of time. And now it's formalised by pretty much every country who matters in our part of the world. Secondly, one of the key things that we did, and Australia, Indonesia, Singapore and other ASEAN countries worked very hard to persuade the United States that it should join the East Asia Summit. And Hillary Clinton, to her credit, signed up for the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and the US came into the East Asia Summit. In the current context, that's really vital, because it means you've got the ASEAN centrality, but you've got US, China, Russia, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, all in the room at the same time. And so what that does mean is that through the East Asia Summit now, every year, presidents and prime ministers, foreign ministers, and every second year, defence ministers, but that will soon become every year, are in the same room at the same time having a conversation. And this can't but help. It has to help. And the ambassador's made a similar point. So the fact that we work closely together to get the US into the East Asia Summit has been really important. You can't have an Indo-Pacific without India. And here, Marty and I are in screaming agreement, which is not, of course, for the first time. It's regrettable that APEC has not reached out and invited India to join APEC. But I think if we're not careful, we'll make a really strategic mistake if we allow RCEP to start without India in. And I think we're better off taking our time about that and having India in, or at least having a defined process where India can come in, not some notion that if India wants to come in at some stage, it can. We went out of our way as an international community at key stages to do things in a collaborative way and an orderly way with China to bring China into the regional and international global economy, whether it was allowing them to become a member of the World Trade Organization when we said they're a market economy, when we all knew they weren't, but that got them into the system. And we should be doing the same thing strategically now with India and saying to India, we don't want this to start without there being a defined process where India can join. We don't want India out of APEC and India out of RCEP. That's not going to help our capacity to deal with the great strategic challenges that we have with the current environment between US and China.
Okay. Well, so now we have at least three architecture which is missing something. Indo-Pacific is missing China at the moment. RCEP missing India. CPTPP missing the US. Yeah. So what does this mean? Yeah. Does anyone want to comment? Is this a defective? Yeah.
Well, other countries like Japan, Australia, Indonesia have to be working hard to persuade US administrations, current and subsequent, China and India, that despite whatever difficulties it might cause them on the trade or the economic front, they've got to find a process and a pathway in. That can only help their countries in terms of greater international and regional growth, but in the end, it can only help us. If you're a country like Indonesia, Australia or Japan, what you don't want is a might is right system. So whilst Indonesia is going to end up as the fourth largest economy in the world and a global influence, not just an ASEAN influence, and while Japan is always going to be, a top half dozen economy and a deeply significant player, Australia is a country of 25 million people. We're currently economy number 12, 13 or 14. It works for none of our countries to enter into a might is right system. We want a system where conversation, cooperative dialogue, and talking through forums like East Asia Summit, G20 and UN works for us, where smaller countries can put a view, where you're not always outbidden or beaten in a might is right one-on-one competition, whether that's China, whether that's the US.
Can you explain to us why there is such low trust among the major powers at the moment? And after you answer that, I want to ask either Stephen or Pak Marty to talk about your experience, because Indonesia and Australia were in a bad shape, low trust in the year 2000 after the East Timor saga, right? I think we didn't want to have anything to do with Australia for some time, for the short term at the time. But things changed dramatically. Trust developed dramatically, and now Indonesia and Australia are strategic partners, right? So we both prove that trust deficit does not have to be permanent, right? So Ichiro, please start. Why is it so low among the major powers? And I would like to have one of you.
Why? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Why trust is so low among the major powers? Yeah.
I think the trust is very low. This is true. But I do not agree with Graham Allison type of analysis, Thucydides trap, saying that if you look at 16 rivalries, 14 has went to war and all that, that time it was between powers trying to take more land, money. This time, it's not only that. I think there's a fundamental difference is democracy. Would you really believe in democracy? Would you like to make your country a no voting, no freedom of speech country? Or would you rather go with country with more democracy? I think there's this fundamental difference, and I think many countries are thinking that although they may not really like Mr. Trump's way of doing things, but very basic American democracy is accepted in many Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, but no country would like to follow the Chinese step. I think that's the very fundamental difference. And I think, so of course the trust is not that high, but we should not really look at them as standing on equal footing. Of course, as for Japan, we are neighbor to China, we are neighbor to North Korea, South Korea. We have to have good relations, so it's not to make relations bad or anything, but in the very end, we have to have that notice. It's not the power monger type of sort of, how should I say, power politics. It's more a beliefs as well. Thank you.
How did you rebuild trust? How did our two countries rebuild trust? Maybe this is a lesson for others here.
Well, before that, if I may, Padino, I'd like to the point that you made earlier, your very perceptive recognition of the absence of U.S. within the TPP or China and the like. I think doesn't it remind us how potentially important is the East Asia Summit. The East Asia Summit, which Indonesia, ASEAN, Australia, all of us worked hard on and developed, already provides a tent for all. Basically, the key countries of the Indo-Pacific, they are not all of them, but the key countries of, well, I don't want to use the term key, but the countries of the Indo-Pacific as they are already under one tent. And yet, I feel ASEAN itself is not yet fully utilizing this forum. It has become, like I have said before, almost like a hello and goodbye forum. Leaders meet towards the end of the year, and there is not much actionable, relevant impact on situation on the ground. Hence, when I mentioned such the need for crisis management capacity, for trust building, I believe that the East Asia Summit, as a manifestation of the Indo-Pacific outlook, is one that should be built. Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel at a time of geopolitical uncertainties, you will have very incomplete processes and the like. But on trust building, well, whether it be Indonesia, Australia, intra-Southeast Asia, within ASEAN, because we would all recognize that at one time, within Southeast Asia, the relationship between countries of Southeast Asia were also marked by trust deficit. But things transform, things change. What are the constituent qualities, elements needed? I guess first and foremost, leadership. The leaders, the decision makers of the countries concerned must be resolute, must exercise leadership in wanting to change the dynamics. They must have the courage, have the resilience, have the patience to understand the other's position. understanding the other's position is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of your confidence that you are able to open up, to communicate, to understand, and better appreciate where they're coming from, and therefore address the issue of intent. Ultimately, I can talk to Stephen and others in Australia, in those ASEAN countries, and have personal confidence, personal chemistry and confidence in their good, the reliability of what they say as things are. But I'm not sure whether that type of willingness to communicate. We have a situation, I recall just now earlier, but you asked a question. We have so many forums, and yet how come there is a trust deficit? There is an important difference between hearing and listening. In some cases, we have forums, magnificent summit settings, and leaders and decision makers make remarks. We hear them, but we don't necessarily listen to what they say. And I think, aside from the obvious, meaning the need for governance, architecture, and processes, organizations, ultimately is to do with personal willingness to see the way things are from the other side, and to listen and to transform things. But leadership, in my view, is extremely important. I mean, President Ramos Horta was here earlier this morning. At one time, but I was on the other side. We were on the other side, debating and having diametrically opposite view to whatever President Ramos Horta said. But things occur. We need to recalibrate the new situation. How can we protect our national interests within this new setting? And it requires new forms of communication. But I don't think there's any magic wand, any magic formula where you can immediately transform a trust deficit to a strategic trust. But the role of the leaders, the decision makers, are extremely strategic and extremely important.
The policy uncertainty I referred to about the United States makes countries in South and Southeast Asia and North Asia nervous. I was one of the 3 people who put their hand up this morning when you said, will Trump be re-elected? Because I think he will. Not that I necessarily want that to occur. But people are saying, countries are saying, will the United States go back to sort of the position it was in between World War I and World War II of isolationist, America first, looking very domestically and inward looking? That doesn't send confidence to smaller countries in our part of the world, or to larger countries like Japan or Korea or Indonesia or Australia. So uncertainty causes a lack of confidence, then causes people to hedge and to buttress. So the Trump uncertainty is really, will the US still be in the Indo-Pacific for the long haul? That causes consternation. Secondly, it's the Chinese aggression, the Deng Xiaoping consensus over a much more assertive and aggressive China. And that also causes uncertainty. So I think that's the root cause of the deficit, because you've got those 2 countries giving messages to the rest of the Indo-Pacific, which causes consternation and worry, at the same time as they're in a strategic competition. What we don't also know is, what's China's ultimate strategic objective here? Does it want to be a hegemonic power in its part of the world? Does it just want space around itself to guarantee its trade routes, and that's the rationale for its unlawful conduct in the South China Sea? Or does it want to be the hegemonic power in all of Asia, or generally? And so that strategic uncertainty is not known either. So that's, I think, at the root cause of the uncertainty and the trust deficit. Can you rebuild a trust deficit? Of course you can. And we've got 2 classic illustrations here. Firstly, you have to remember your history. So in 19 After World War II, in 1946-47, Australian diplomats came to Indonesia to seek to assist Indonesia in its efforts for independence. They were deported immediately to Singapore because the post-World War II Allied commanders were preparing themselves for the re-entry of the Dutch. And so Australia's diplomats were rebuffed. We then started the job with the UN of making sure the UN supported Indonesia's independence and its emergence as a member of the UN. Australia moved Indonesia's independence and membership of the UN, seconded by India. So that always gave us a ground floor in the relationship. So when we went through difficult patches, two things would occur. One, people who knew reminded their interlocutors of the history, and secondly, despite the bad days, people would always talk. There were always people in Australia who wanted the relationship to be successful, and people in Indonesia who wanted it to be successful as well. There's a very good example with Japan. After a bitter war in the Pacific at the end of World War II, 12 years later, Australia and Japan had signed a formal trade agreement which saw Australia helping in the rebuilding of Japan's infrastructure and its economy, and that saw for many decades Japan being Australia's best friend and strongest supporter in Asia, and also Japan being Australia's leading trading partner till as late as 2009. So you can overcome any or all of these difficulties. In the case of the US and China, remember, it was Kissinger and Nixon who basically said in 1972, we want to recognise China with a one China policy. We want China to emerge into the world's economy and into the world. And despite all of the concern about China and all of our worries, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty into a decent standard of living. And that's been a fantastic and remarkable achievement, which has been done with international community support. What drives the trust deficit is uncertainty about China's strategic intentions and uncertainty about the United States' long-term intention to stay active within our broader Indo-Pacific region.
Okay. Ichiro, I would love to get your take on Russia.
I can't hear you well.
Okay.
Is this the last round?
Yes, yeah.
Is this the last?
Yes, this is the last round, yeah. So, yeah.
And you want me to talk about Russia?
Yes, yeah.
Russia, I think our relations are difficult. The Prime Minister is trying to get our territory back, but has really put a lot of effort, but has not really resulted in any progress. I think we have to continue. But taking this opportunity, I would like to, as this is my last intervention, I would like to talk about something a little bit more general. I was really amazed with this meeting, and I've never seen anything like this. When Dino called me from Jakarta and told me that it's going to be a huge crowd, but I thought, hey, Dino is always exaggeration things, so it's not going to be really big. But no. It was really great. And what he amazed me was that only 2 months after he arrived in Washington, he gave a big party, Indonesian culture party, and gathered so many people. Usually ambassadors do that after 1 year or 2 years, after making a lot of friends. But he made friends through these cultural. And maybe it's partly because not only of Dino, but people wanted to see beautiful Rosa. But then still, that was a great success. Now, talking about our discussion of trust and hot or cold war, I would like to propose in the end 4 things are important to do and remember. A, B, C, D. A, for arms control. It's very disappointing that Trump has annihilated INF. I think there should be arms control with United States, Russia, and China as well. And we have to be very tight in arms control, not to see that any country like North Korea would erupt. That's A. B, Bretton Woods, WTO, IMF, and also UN should be reviewed. We cannot really go on with what we have because it's not functioning. After 70 years, anything has to be reviewed. My doctor tells me that I have to review all my habit too. And so that's what is. C, for climate change. I think this is where all of us can work together. We have to call United States back into Paris Agreement and do that climate change really, like Greta-san says. D is for democracy. Let's not pretend that it's a power game. It's a democracy's issue. Look at Hong Kong, what's happening in Hong Kong. So I think we all have to keep that, and I hope you'll understand, mari kita bekerja bersama. Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak.
Okay, I've been asked that we need to close because you need to go to lunch, right? And then come back at 1 o'clock for our next parallel session. But I want to ask Steve and Pak Marty, closing 2 minutes on what do you think is the strategic opportunities that we see to undo the hard piece here?
Well, rather than talking in strategic opportunity terms, let me talk in terms of being positive about the ultimate outcome or negative about it. And whilst I'm pessimistic about the track that we're going down now, and I think we're in for some tough times, ultimately I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because in the end, whether it's China, the United States, Japan, Indonesia, or Australia, what people are interested in is prosperity for their country and their people. And I think that despite all of the strategic competition between US and China, in the end, under different systems, they're both chasing prosperity for their people, as is Indonesia, Japan, and Australia. And one of the points the ambassador made is that in a communist-controlled country, it's very hard for a communist administration to make sure that everyone of a country is afforded an opportunity and has a prosperous or better standard of living. One of the reasons we've seen difficulties with trade and populism and nationalism, and I'll use the United States as an example, because this is one of the reasons why Trump was elected, people in democracies seeing their chance, including in the United States, seeing their chance of the American dream being lost for them and their children. So a loss of economic prosperity, a loss of economic opportunity, being economically alienated. And that's caused difficulties in the United States, which has helped see Trump elected, and it's also, in my view, part of the heart of the Brexit argument in the United Kingdom. So all of us, when we're running countries, when we're watching countries operate, in the end, the challenge for a country is to give their people prosperity. And that's why hardly any people put their hand up to the question, is there going to be World War III? Because in the end, countries, whether it's China, US, or our own countries represented on the stage, in the end, they're chasing prosperity. And so ultimately, I think there's going to be a successful outcome. It's going to be lots of hiccups and lots of difficulties along the way.
Marty?
Well, thank you very much, Pak Dino. I believe that it's extremely important, all of us who has intentions and wish to see a more peaceful, prosperous, and stable world, to be as urgent in our conduct, in our behavior to realize such a vision. We cannot simply rely on aspiration. We have to wage perjuangkan. We have to wage peace in a very aggressive way. As aggressive as those who are proponents of the alternative world vision, a vision of the world. So we must be persistent, we must be resilient, we must be persuasive in making the case that the hot peace that you are speaking of is not an inevitable situation. It is possible to alter dynamics. It is possible to build trust out of the out of the trust deficit that we have. But we need to have concrete ideas, concrete policies. Mere outlook, mere visions, mere plans, mere intentions are not good enough. And I would like, out of this forum, to be able to identify one or even just 2 points how we can realize that. I mean, I've put a suggestion, just 2 suggestions. One, given the uncertainties, given the difficult relations and trust deficits that we have all around the world, then we need a more effective crisis management capacity. Because things happen out there, and yet we don't have a forum, a platform to discuss and to manage these issues. The United Nations Security Council, of which Indonesia is a member right now, find itself often case unable to take decisions when it relates to issues that impact on the major powers. So we need to find ways and means, starting from here within our region and our immediate environment, how can we build a relevant, a timely, actionable crisis management capacity. And the second point that I was trying to suggest is to codify behavior that, notwithstanding all kind of difficulties that we have in our relations with one another, disputes, territorial and non-territorial, and in full respect of every country's sovereign right for self-defense and to protect and their territorial integrity, etc., in full compliance and full respect of those UN Charter principles, we can also at the same time say we will solve our problems by peaceful means, by dialogue, primacy of diplomacy. And one final point, Pak Dino, since this is about Indonesian foreign policy, Indonesia have in the past traditionally have always been conducting a foreign policy that is transformative. It is not simply about numbers. You can't often quantify foreign policy, diplomacy in numbers, in terms of only in trades, investment. They are important, but our foreign policy have always been transformative, more than merely commerce, we are not pursuing merely transactional foreign policies. And I would like, and I'm hopeful, that a forum such as yours can come up with ideas to transform the setting that we have and not to simply accept things as they are. But thank you very much for having us this morning, Pak.
Thank you. You know, I've known Pak Marty for 32 years, and this is the first time I sit so close to him. Good. Let's give a big hand to all our panelists. Yeah.